Welcome to episode 6 of Raise the Bar with me, your host, Daryl LeBar. In this episode, we're going to change gears and take a look at some JavaScript modules. And actually, we're going to use TypeScript to look at those JavaScript modules, just to make it a little bit easier, as well as to get you familiar with what TypeScript is or why you'd want to use it on your projects, especially when you're dealing with Dynamics 365 CRM. So, let's go ahead and get started. So here I've got just a simple example of kind of the first baby step. I kind of see there being different steps, different stages of growth with people that are new to JavaScript and learning JavaScript, especially even experienced developers in the C# world that are transferring over to, oh, now I need to know how to do more than just plugins and workflows and backend services. I need to do some client scripting. And so I'm going to walk through those with different modules and then get to kind of where I see the end goal is and where I like to be on my projects. It's, again, full disclosure, I'm not always there on my projects because lots of times you come into a project and there's a lot of stuff that's already existing, or maybe it's just a really, really small project and you need one file and you don't need all the maintenance and overhead of all that kind of stuff. Totally, I get it. But this is kind of like the from just a little bit more than like 2 or 3 files. Hey, this is what you're going to be wanting to be using. This is what I recommend, and this is what I'm pushing for everywhere I go. So let's go ahead and get started here. So in this example, we have a simple onload function. This would be something that you normally call in your form onload, and it's being called, and you'd set the call from the actual onload function in CRM. So this would be what you'd set up in the form onload, and left here we have TypeScript, and then right here we have JavaScript. Look at that, it's the same exact thing. And people say, oh, I don't know how to learn TypeScript. It's pretty much the same thing. You just add some typing whenever you need it. In this case, we don't even need it. It's exactly the same. So great. So, and I'm using the little playground here, typescriptlang.org/play, to go in and create these demos here. So this is the first example of what someone new to TypeScript or new to JavaScript would do. And this works just fine until you ever run into an instance where somebody else declares the same exact file, the same exact function name in a different file. And that file gets loaded after your file. So this onload is actually in the global namespace. So if I go ahead and call onload here, okay, that function is this function right here, which means that it's global. It's everywhere. In this file and any other file that the JavaScript engine for that browser has loaded and is running. So that's really bad because if another file has another function with the exact same name, it's going to overwrite, or you're going to overwrite, depending on who gets loaded last. That's a bad thing, okay? So that's the very first step that I see people on, the very first step I see people doing, and it gets worse as you get more and more functions, function A, function B, and all that kind of stuff. You're continually adding more and more conflicts to the global namespace. That's a bad thing. You don't want to be doing that. So how do you get around that? What's the next baby step that I see people take? Well, there's this example, and that's using, you're basically using modules. And there's different ways of doing this. I'll explain the modules first, and I'll look at an example of classes in JavaScript, and that's another way as well. I don't recommend it for most things in CRM, just because it doesn't make sense. But let's just go through and see what we've done here. So I said, hey, I've got a module, and this is going to end on my lead form. So hypothetically, I'm working with lead here. And I have a function there that's onload. That function is exported, which means that it can be publicly available from outside that. Now I might have my lead to onload, and everything works fine. So if I go and look see how the JavaScript is doing this, just to try to help people that haven't seen this before, it is declaring this lead variable here. And this lead variable in JavaScript, you can declare the same variable multiple times. So if I go in here and I say, hey, lead, you can go through and do that. It's not going to give you any sort of issues. It's just going to ignore that it's already been declared. C#, you'd have a problem. JavaScript, no. So it declares this lead variable, and then it's going to call, if I match the curly, the parentheses here, it's going to go through and execute whatever is in this thing. And what's in this thing is this actual function that's defining. So it's defining this function. It does have a name that accepts a lead variable, and inside of here, it's declaring an onload, and then it's taking that lead variable and it's adding to it this onload, which is this function. So if I remove that export, we see that line goes away because it's no longer publicly available. This is the way that we're making methods within this thing publicly available versus privately available. And then it says, okay, so this lead variable was declared. If it exists, then go ahead and use it. If it doesn't, create a new object and call this function. So this function is being declared and immediately called right afterwards with the syntax. So that's how that is happening. That's how we're wrapping things in JavaScript. I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit, see if that's a little bit easier to read. but we'll see. So that's how that's actually working in JavaScript. That's like the first step. So what does this buy you? This buys you not have to worry about anybody else having an onload function that's going to conflict with yours. Now we're still adding this lead here to the global namespace, which generally isn't as big of a deal, and generally you want to give it a more concise name. So your XYZ lead. If you're dealing with your own company XYZ. And you might see things like this as well, where people take whatever it is inside of there and make a couple modules here and nest those modules. So this is another way that we see this, where you've defined XYZ module in every single one of your files, and then you have got separate modules for each one of those files, and they all kind of go together. I mean, it works just fine, because if it loads one file that has XYZ, if it has already loaded another one, it just adds to it by passing it in and adding to the XY lead value. If not, it creates a new one. So it's just going to add to it, and so at the end of the day, once all the files have loaded, you have all these separate functions and all these separate modules on your XYZ module. So that's kind of the first stage I see. And rather than using modules, you could use classes. It's very, very similar in some ways. One thing that classes kind of mess you up with is using the this function. This can get kind of confusing and can cause you issues sometimes if you're calling it from another function, and this you're expecting to be the class, but it's actually the caller, and so that's sometimes confusing. That's the reason why I don't recommend using classes for most things in CRM. Unless you're doing something that you are creating multiple instances of something, then yes, use a class. But by default, we usually have one basic static instance for a form. I don't need to create multiple instances of my lead logic. I just need the one. So that's why I usually stick the modules within CRM. But if I'm doing something else where I'm having to go through and create some other data to keep track of things, then yeah, I might use classes inside of that. So it's not a don't use classes. It's just general first step. You probably want to look to use the modules. And the good rule of thumb there that I follow is, if that module is if you're going to use it once, you're going to have one instance of it, make it a module. If you need multiple instances of it, make it a class. And so you can see the declaration here. It's kind of similar. We've declared this lead, and it's going to be the result of whatever this function is. So this function, again, is creating this lead function as well. In this lead function, it goes ahead and assigns this onload function to that lead, and it returns that lead. And now our lead, we have to instantiate the new version of the lead, and then we get to call onload. So that's just kind of the class way of approaching the JavaScript. So this is a great next step. It's a great next place to be there. But now you start running into problems where you are going to have issues where different files are loading in a different time. By default in CRM, you list, here are the files I want to load for this form. Here are the dependencies that I have. And even in CRM 9, you get to list the actual dependencies, but all that work is done in CRM itself, which makes it incredibly expensive to maintain, because it's not an easy way to say, hey, I want to go ahead and update all these dependencies for this file, or I want to add a new dependency. And so that's when we get into actual real-life module loading and asynchronous module loading, because by default, what we tend to have is a base, I tend to have a base script per form, and then I might have multiple common scripts that I'm using. I might have a script that I'm using to do my web access for web requests. I might have a script that I'm using for doing common code, like accessing null-safe accessing of attributes and values and things like that. So that's how we get into this final stage here, where we have separate modules defined in separate classes. And I mentioned it earlier where we have that. This works great until you've got problems with that loading of the stuff. So how do you deal with loading of it? Because I could have an issue where my lead is depending on my common.js, and this common.js, they blowed up usually. So rather than having a small little common.js, you could have a really big common.js because you got lots of things you've added there. That becomes a problem when the lead file is super, super small, because now both the files will get kicked off asynchronous to load, and the common.js will take longer to load, and now the lead will finish loading first, and it will attempt to execute, and it will blow chow on this common, because this common actually hasn't been loaded yet. It hasn't gone through and added the common that alert to the common. So how do you handle those issues with potential loading issues? There's really not a supported way to do that in CRM previous to 9. In 9, we do get to do your dependencies. I believe it does handle that correctly. But what if you're dealing with code that isn't in CRM 9? I'm still working on CRM 2013. I've got to deal with that in all those instances. And I've got to deal with having to maintain that in CRM, which is something that I don't really like to do. I like to be able to do all that within the code itself. And that's when we get into actually asynchronous module loaders. And this is kind of the final step that I see for JavaScript for dealing with your modules. So let's take a look at that. And I'm going to have to get out of the playground here because the playground doesn't have the concept of different files, and we're going to need that for that. But just as an example, in here, we're still dealing with declaring these things, XYZ variables, in the global namespace. Modules gets outside of that and causes you to not have to worry about that. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to put an export in this to CRM, not to CRM, to TypeScript. And over here we'll see, oh, all this stuff happened. Now this is using the EMD method of declaring things and loading modules. And with it added all this extra stuff, which is basically saying, hey, give me everything I require and give me something that I can add everything I export. And so it's going to add everything to the exports for this particular module. So it's exporting as XYZ company, and that's keep things separate, basically. And so if I go and do this as well for this, we can see that once again it does the same exact thing, and it's all wrapped in there. But I can't show how to actually do this within the actual how it should be working within separate files. Let's go ahead and take a look at VS Code. So in here I've got an example of what we saw before with my common TS, my lead TS, and I'm giving a super simple example of my window.alert, which is rather a poor example because you shouldn't be using alert, you should be using the CRM methodology of doing that. But hey, for this example, this works. So in my lead, I need to go through and declare that I want to import that actual file. And so I say, hey, go ahead and import the common file, and you can actually see there's the path to my common file. And then I want to declare in here the actual name of it. Notice I haven't given this thing a name just besides common. But in here, I get to declare the actual name of it. Say, hey, this common, I'm going to call it XYZ common. And I've got XYZ common in here as this module. And in here, this is how I'm referring to my XYZ common. And you can now see that we're getting full IntelliSense, everything's wrapped in here because we're using TypeScript, which is great because if I decide that, hey, you need to give me a string and you need to give me a number, okay, you know, I can go ahead and do that, and I get my full IntelliSense. It says, hey, no, you need a number here for the second variable. I can go ahead and make that optional. I get that question mark on here, and it's happy again. If I try to give it another string, it's going to yell at me. If I give it a number, it's happy. I mean, that's just the power of TypeScript, being able to give you that typing. But let's go back to what it was before. And let's go ahead and see what this looks like in the actual JavaScript. So in the JavaScript, if I go and look at let's look at the lead JS here. We can see that we've got the same define section here. And I'm actually configuring these things in UMD, Universal Module Definitions. So they work both in CommonJS and an AMD, which is like require.js would be your module loader for this. But basically you're requiring a module loader. I've recently started using Steel.js as my module loader, but it doesn't matter. I think Steel.js is a little bit closer to the future version of modules and is getting some active development on it. So that's why I'm on the Steel.js. If you're going to use require.js, that's great. You'll probably see a few more examples out there in the CRM world at the very least. So to each their own, but you're going to need a module loader in order to do this, in order to load all these modules, but it does all this tying for you. And the way that it works here is in this defined logic here, it actually lists the definition of what it actually requires. So in here you can see that we actually require common, and this is going to be in the, again, AMD modules, asynchronous module definitions. Here, we have the CommonJS method of dealing with it. We're actually declaring our require statement here. Now, they're both going to work the same way. They're both going to load things asynchronously, and that's why I'm using the EMD versus just the CommonJS, because that way if someone's using Node or something, something's using Node, this works just fine for them as well. So it works with both ways. In here, it's gone through and added that require.js. Now, this work of going through and figuring out everything that's required is done by the browser, done by the module loader. So it's going to say, hey, in my actual load of my lead form, I'm going to put this XYZ company.lead.onload. I'm going to call that from my module loader. So my module loader, I'm going to say, hey, go ahead and load the lead.js file and call this function XYZ company.lead.onload. And so that module loader is going to load the file. When it loads the file, it's going to go through and find undefined statements, find what's required, and it's going to load those things asynchronously and figure out what it actually needs and load them all up, which is great because now I'm not dependent on CRM to put all those dependencies in there. I can make anything I want to make required. I just list in the top that I'm making this required. If I decide to split CommonJS, it gets too big, and I want to do CommonJS forms and CommonJS logic or something, I can split the file and then I just add it to whoever actually needs it by putting a new import statement in there. So, super easy to do that. And it does basically everything for you. And so the module loader's job is to go through and pick those files and load them up. Now there's two ways you can do that. You can do that real life in the browser, or you can do it at build time when you're building things. I tend to just make it a little bit simpler and keep it on the browser side of things because the browser caches everything. So I'm not paying the penalty of having to load those files every single time. They get cached, so I don't worry about it. So that's kind of the way that those modules work. So yeah, so that loads that common calls that common.alert, and everything's good, everyone's happy, and the world's a happy place. And you no longer are polluting that global namespace because now you're using the module loader to say, hey, load these files and load them all in. That way, if someone happens to load another file that has that same issue or that same namespace that you're trying to write in, you're not going to get a conflict. So unless they're loading this, unless you're saying to load that through an actual module loader, and even in there, you can actually configure in module loaders of what you want to actually name these things, so you can get rid of those conflicts as well. So that's that's the whole stage from A to B, or A to C, or A to D, I guess, because we have kind of the first baby step where, hey, it's Onload, it's in the global namespace. You could easily have issues where other people are going to be overwriting it. They're not grouped together, and there's lots of things that are issues with this level. The next level, okay, now we actually have modules, but they're still in the global namespace. They're not really asynchronous modules. They're just modules that get loaded in the global namespace, and they don't declare any of their dependencies. Same thing with classes. And then finally we get to these actual modules where we're exporting them and we're actually adding to their dependencies. So again, you could do your entire CM project just like this. It's going to work until you have issues where it doesn't work, which is kind of painful, right? But if you're actually doing true module loading with a module loader like require.js or skill.js, then this is how you go through and define your dependencies, and it's going to work every single time, which is great. And you don't even have to worry about doing any complicated build scripts if you don't want to. Just let it load up in the browser, however you'd like to load in the browser. And it will cache things, and it's actually really, really fast. I found that by default, CRM will not cache my very first file that I'm loading. So if I build all of my JavaScript into a single file, it doesn't get cached on form load, which is really painful. But with a module loader, it's going to load that first file, and I'm going to pay the penalty of loading the module loader. But then after that, everything else is getting cached by the browser. And so I don't have to pay the penalty of loading all those files. They're already loaded pretty much. So that's what I found to work, and that's what I found to really be the ultimate end goal when it comes to modules in JavaScript and in TypeScript. So hopefully you found this Raise the Bar entertaining and useful and helpful. If you have any other topics you'd like me to cover in the future, please let me know. You can drop me a line on my Twitter account or reply to this video on YouTube. Twitter account is ddlabar. Feel free to reach out and say, hey, I'd like you to review something, or I'd like you to talk about something, and I'll go ahead and add it to my list of things to do. But that's all for now. Thank you for joining me, and have a great day.